I'll give people time to reflect on the talk and get warmed up for the questions. So I'll start asking some questions myself. So we'll start before we move into technical aspects. Let me ask you some questions which are a bit less technical. The first one is, let's say, about your trajectory, your personal trajectory. That you studied mathematics and philosophy and cognitive science, and then you did a PhD in cognitive science. I was wondering how you got interested in this particular area of studying concepts, and if I can add to that, fast forward into the future, what made you move from studying logics and more symbolic models to this geometric way of thinking?
Yeah, you said I studied mathematics and philosophy. Actually, I also studied computer science, and I was interested in AI at a very early stage, but this was the stage when you were still doing everything in first order logic, and I was writing my program in Lisp, which was a hell. But anyway, that's my origin. Now, your question about concepts is that I was doing a bit of philosophy of science, and I got interested in the problem of induction. And the question is, when there was this Hempel paradox is saying that, okay, we know that all ravens are black, but all ravens are black is logically equivalent to all non-black things are non-ravens. So if you observe a brown shoe, that should be support for a non-black thing being a non-raven. And that's of course a paradox. So my question then became, what are natural concepts? A non-raven is not a natural concept. So that was my entrance to the study of concepts. But then, of course, I turned from the philosophy of science problems to semantic problems. And then I got back. I have colleagues working on robotics, and I got involved in this EU project, and I worked with people in Sydney and Australia. So I combined my interest in conceptual spaces and semantics with robotic applications. That's a short version of my trajectory.
Thank you. This is an interesting point that, in ontology as well, people tend to be very suspicious of negative and disjunctive concepts for different reasons, right? So like David Armstrong, for example, would say that types are very much related to powers, which are given to entities, to the instance, right? So negative types wouldn't bestow any powers to things or disjunctive things. Very interesting. So my second question is actually not technical at all. I know you're very interested. So I watched your TEDx talk about how to motivate students, right? And I know you're very interested in this topic of motivation. And now, with COVID and all that, we had to go through this massive adaptation on the fly, right? So I was wondering if you have insights of how can we move to a model in which we can leverage on this experience and perhaps be a little bit more creative, right? Universities tend to be quite conservative sometimes, but without losing something that you highlight in that talk, which is the importance of giving feedback, direct feedback, personalized feedback, but also the social interaction, the cooperation, and so on. So how do you see the education after COVID in that sense?
That's a very good question. It's totally outside my talk, but it doesn't matter. No, of course, I find I've given some talks, I've given lectures on Zoom and Skype and Teams and so on. And it's not as rewarding as being in a classroom. I mean, or even on a dyad interaction, just you and me. I mean, we have problems in getting eye contact because the camera is not located where I see. So we lose immediately eye contact, and that's quite important in an ordinary dialogical interaction. And I must say, I mean, when I listen to Zoom talks or Teams talks, I get bored. And of course, it's much easier to have a split vision. You do something on the side while you're listening to a talk, and that means you're losing a lot. So being in a classroom has a lot of benefits. I don't know how to improve this interaction. I mean, I haven't really thought about it. Of course, the teacher must make the listeners, the students, give feedback and react as often as possible. I mean, a talk like today, where I talk for almost an hour and then we have questions, is not optimal. I mean, it's much better if students can ask and interact, and they can show by their facial expressions whether they understand or not. As when you become experienced as a teacher, it's very easy. You do it unconsciously. You see whether the students follow or not, and you see whether they are motivated or not. I mean, this is something you learn. And this is much more difficult on these digital systems. That's all I can say at the moment.
Thank you, Peter. So now moving to more technical things. One of the topics that we discussed in several talks in this series, so for example, when we had Melanie Mitchell and Christian Fellbaum as well, was the topic of metaphors and analogy, and the role that analogy has for thinking, right? And you touched this briefly with your example in with colors, with skin colors. I like that very much because it shows very clearly this idea of analogy as structural transferring, right?
Yep.
So
yes.
To elaborate on that, on the use of conceptual space for analogical reasoning.
Yeah. I wish I had and I normally show a picture here, but the general idea is that a metaphor is a transfer of a pattern from one domain to another. And by using my domain concept, I can make the idea of a pattern a little bit more precise. So in the color example, it was actually transforming a domain onto itself, but a smaller copy of itself. So it's a kind of special case of a metaphor there. It's a radial projection, if you want to be a little bit more mathematical there. But in general, you have mappings from time to space, very common metaphors. And you have mappings from up and down to more and less. I mean, this is in Lakoff and Johnson's book on metaphors we live by. They say that more is up. That's a very, very common metaphor. So, but my point here is that by having this geometric representation, up is a vertical dimension, and more is another, more or less is another one-dimensional mapping. You know how to map one dimension onto one dimension. That's easy. But you can also have combinations. So I normally talk about a metaphor like a peak of a career. So peak is the highest point on a curve. And this curve you can say then the peak of a career is, then you map the horizontal dimension of the peak of a mountain, say, onto time, and you map the vertical dimension of the mountain on the status. That is more is up. Higher up in a career means higher up here. And if you do that, if you do a life representation of a career, you start low, you go higher, and then you have the highest point in your career, and then you go down again. So by having this double mapping, time to space and status onto a vertical dimension, you get a peak, literally a peak in the pattern. So I think that I can fill in more about why metaphors are mapping between domains by using these geometric structures. That would be my answer. Then doing this computationally is not easy, but I think we can do simple metaphors in this way at least. Time to space shouldn't be too difficult.
You mentioned the Lakoff there. I was wondering, because the model of events as forces, it's very clear for the case of physical events, right? But if we're dealing with, getting married or dreaming and so on, right? Would you think that we are also dealing with metaphors in this case, this kind of transfer to explain the semantics of these events?
Very good point. I mean, I talked about physical forces, but we are not always good Newtonians, because intentions function as forces. That would be my short answer. So a lot of human interaction build on the intentions driving the interaction. So my short answer to your question here would be that we expand the domain of forces with intentions as well.
I see.
Yeah.
Now, if I turn to I like very much this idea of distinguishing concepts and properties the way you do, and I see how it corresponds to a classical notion of predicates in classical logics, right? But let me, let's say, take some further distinctions that would come from ontology, and I would ask you, how would you map to these distinctions in space in terms of convex regions, right? So one famous distinction is one, for example, put forth by Peter Strawson between sortals and characterizing types. So the first question would be that if we take characterizing types, so what is sometimes called mixins, take, for example, the notion of a customer. A customer can be a person or an organization, right? Or the notion of a cultural heritage item, right? This looks like a concept, but it doesn't look like something that would be a convex region, right? All these different mixings.
Yeah. Now you're giving me a tough time because you use abstract nouns here, and that means I would have to represent to you the space of economic transactions, or I would have to represent a lot of things concerning cultural heritage. I have no idea of how to handle that in terms of what are the structures of the underlying domains and so on. So that's too tough for me. I can't do that on the fly. I'm sorry. But I agree that we need more analysis of the underlying structures of these abstract nouns. I've devoted most of my work to more concrete things.
Mm-hmm. If we look then at the sortals, at the space of sortal, you would still have, for example, so you mentioned nouns, right? And nouns would be concepts. Nouns are the, let's say, the linguistic counterparts of this idea of sortals in ontology. And then you have there sortals which are dynamic in terms of dynamic classification. They seem to me like moving shadows or moving convex regions. So husbands and parents and students and clients and presidents and so on. Mm-hmm. So how would you deal with this kind of dynamic classification types of convex regions in conceptual space?
Yeah, again, this is dependent. I mean, if you have a parent, you need a classification in different kinds of kinship relations and so on. And you need for teacher or president, you need an analysis of a societal structure. I think that people have done a little bit on kinship relations, and it turns out, I mean, there is a Dutch linguist, Swartz, who has shown that by given a very smart representation of kinship dimensions, basically going down in time is the horizontal dimension. I'm sorry, the vertical dimension, but going up in time is the vertical dimension. You get the two-dimensional space. And then you can see that cousin, for instance, would come out as a convex space in that a convex region in that space. So for kinship relation, maybe I can identify convexity. For other society relations, I have no clue on how to do it. But then you're talking about, I mean, parent and teacher and so on. These are roles, and that's another layer of structure that has to be added to it. And as you say, they are dynamic. You shift roles here.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Okay.
So for many of these cultural, societal nouns, I must confess, I have very little idea on how to analyze them.
I see.
Yeah. So for me. So the human-robot interaction should be all about concrete things and concrete properties, and then I may be able to solve the problem.
I see. So I'll ask another question about predicates as well, which is this idea of higher order types or higher order predicates, right? One thing I find very interesting that higher order relations, for example, they are encoded in the geometry itself of the space, right? Yep. So, like, for example, talking about adjacent colors, right? It's this geometry itself that codes that relation, right? Or being opposite colors, or even being an order space, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But this limits higher order types to second order types. So what about if we had to express, for example, a third order predicate? How would that look like? Or can we imagine a situation in which we want to look at one entire space as a point, for example, to talk about the life expectancy of people in general and order different animals in life expectancies, for example?
Oh, yeah, okay, you catch me offhand here again. I mean, let me say that you said adjacent color. That's a good example. I've used the simple relations like longer than or stronger than and so on. I mean, ordinary binary relations, and you can map them onto. You have mapped the value of one of the thing, the one object x, and on one axis, and another object. Or x should be in that axis and y on that, and then you just say that if y is longer than x, that means that the y value is on the upper above the diagonal in this representation. So you get this two-dimensional area that represents the this binary relation. And if you talk about higher order relations, I would maybe try to answer it in terms of product spaces. You take product spaces and then you find regions in these product spaces. But I would have to, your life expectancy case, I would have to sit down and think about how the product space would look like and what regions would come out. That would be an exercise for me, but I think I could handle that exercise.
Very nice. This seems like very interesting topics of research, right? To deal with conceptual spaces. So let me go back to the beginning of your presentation. When you were, revisiting this history of cognitive science, from symbolic models to connectionist models and so on. Nowadays, I mean, I see this debate between, let's say, purely learning models and let's say conceptual models as almost a reenactment of the whole nativism versus empiricist debate, right? So this idea of what is innate, if there should be some innate structure, or if everything could be learned. So I was wondering, where do you stand there in that debate?
I'm more on the empiricist side, because if you go to language and the innateness of language, I don't believe it's all in Chomsky's idea about innate grammars or innate structures. I think we learn these structures. On the other hand, we come prepared. I mean, I talked about the differences between the nouns and the verbs and so on. We come prepared in identifying noun categories. We learn very, very quickly to identify, to talk about nouns. That's the first thing that children use. They learn verbs. And actually, adjectives come a bit later in their linguistic development, because then you have to separate out a particular domain in order to understand what is the meaning of an adjective. So I'm more an empiricist in this. But of course, I mean, I think that something like this, separating objects from actions, is I shouldn't say, I could say prepared by our brains. I mean, you have two pathways in the brain. You have the dorsal pathway that picks out actions, what is happening, and you have the ventral pathway that picks out more objects and object properties. So the two pathways in the brain corresponds basically to the distinction between objects and actions.
I see. So before I move to the questions,
so there's a little bit of nativism in my model, but not much.
I see. So before I move to the questions from the audience, let me ask you a final question myself, which is this: I mean, one of the key applications of ontologies is the idea of mini negotiation, right? And it reminds me of this extremely interesting work you did with Massimo Warglian on operations on the space for mini negotiation. So could you please say something about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very interesting problem, because I have my conceptual space. I may mean by a particular color word if I talk about purple. And you talk about purple. We may not have exactly the same. I mean, I say that my tie is purple, and you say no, it's not purple, it's bluish, and we disagree. We have to negotiate. I mean, we have to, in order to be able to cooperate. I mean, if I want you to pick me a purple thing, and you don't mean the same thing, mean the same by purple as I do, we will fail. So in order to cooperate, we need to negotiate our meanings, and that basically means that we have to adjust our partitioning of the spaces. And we do that when we're learning a language. You're basically learning how to partition your space so that you can use your words in the same way as other people do them. And what we've done is a little bit showing that there is always some kind of solution to this meaning negotiation using some kind of fixed point theorems. We can show that this problem is solvable. We have nothing to say or very little to say about how it's solved. I mean, I can be totally dominant on you and impose on you my meaning of purple, or you can be dominant over me, or we can compromise and say that, okay, this is what we mean by purple. But the idea of convexity actually helps us to show that there is always a possible solution.
Okay, thank you. I thought that work was very, very interesting.
Thank
so
you.
I totally recommend that to this audience.
Okay.
So I'll move now.
Please do.
Thank you. I will move to the questions from the audience. So how do you classify imperatives, orders, instructions? They cause actions, but they are not forces.
That's a good question. I should have said that I only concern declaratives when I talked about this kind of construals describing events and so on. And imperatives are different because then you're demanding an action. You have an intention that somebody else does an action. So this is a different kind of communication than expressing a sentence. Actually. An imperative is a normative statement aiming at achieving a particular state or a particular result. So yeah, I would say that most imperatives concern the result of an action rather than the form. Of course, there can be exceptions where you instruct somebody the manner how to do something, but I think that's exceptional. Most of the time, you give a desired result of an action. But it's a question. I mean, I didn't talk about imperatives, nor did I talk about questions, which would be, which is similar to imperatives, actually.
How can you represent metaphorical use of adjectives? For example, a person is hot to mean at the same time that she's pretty, but also talented.
Yeah. A hot person is that's a mapping. I mean, we have lots of force mappings. I mean, persons are attractive. I'm drawn to a person. I find a person pushing me away, and so on. And we have this force interpretation. And of course, hot is then mapped onto the emotion. I mean, hot is positive, attractive mapping. So and it's very common. I mean, this kind of mapping. She's cool to me, and so on. That's an opposite mapping here. But it's basically you take an emotional domain and then you map it onto the temperature domain. So it's a domain-to-domain mapping. Exactly how to describe the emotional domain, I don't know, but the temperature domain we already know how it works like. And then that's of course typical for metaphors. We take it from a less known domain and map it onto a more known domain. Except for in poetry, this is the normal direction of metaphors.
There are several questions about this, actually, about, examples are bitter situation and so on, but you've answered that.
Okay.
Can domains overlap? How many domains are there? Arbitrarily many?
Yeah. That's a big gap in my theory. I don't have a proper definition of a domain. Officially, domains cannot overlap. I mean, regions can overlap, of course. There is a overlap between blue and purple, I guess. I mean, there are vague borders and maybe even overlaps. But domains officially don't overlap. Then, of course, there are problematic cases where I can't find an example from the top of my head, but my official answer is that no, they don't overlap. Regions overlap, not domains. Then, of course, I owe the audience a definition of what characterizes a domain, and there are some psychological tests for what's called separability and integrality between dimensions that I relied on when I defined. So when you listen to a sound, you hear, or music sound, you hear the pitch and you hear the volume, and you maybe hear the sound patterns, where the timbre, as it's called. But that has nothing to do with the color of the instrument or the temperature of the instrument. So the sound dimensions are separate from the color dimensions or from the shape dimensions and so on. So we have some psychological tests for how to identify domains, but they only work for perceptual domains. For more abstract domains like the ones you mentioned, I have no idea of how to tell whether domains are separated or not. So for these domains, I need to do a lot of work, and I'm not sure my method will hold water at the end here.
How can your approach be reconciled with truth conditional Montague type semantics?
I'm not. I don't even try. No, I've given up on trying to formulate. I mean, maybe we can reconcile it, but I'm a cognitive scientist. I'm giving up. And that means I'm not. My semantics is cognitive. So I think that words map onto cognitive structures. They don't map onto reality. While if you're working with truth conditions, you map the meaning of words onto some kind of reality or possible realities, as in Montague semantics, where you need a lot of possible words and so on. But that's not how we use language. I mean, I don't rely on truth conditional. Then, of course, you can maybe reinvent some kind of truth conditional structure in this cognitive semantics. But I think this is putting the cart before the horse. I mean, it's the wrong way to go about it. So my blunt answer is that I don't even try.
Mm-hmm. How would you place the nominalization of phenomena in your representations, especially for process event representations?
Going from verbs to nominals, I guess the question is. That's a very typical thing. I mean, if you have a verb like climb or hit or hunt, I mean, that refers to a vector in the event representation. But of course, there is then an unspecified agent, and going from hunt, the verb hunt, to the agent, then that means you just mark that the agent, the hunter, is who does the hunting. Yeah? So given the event structure, I think we can explain which nominalizations are reasonable and how they work. Of course, it's a matter of what is conventionalized in languages. Some languages conventionalize certain roles and some languages don't. So there are differences. But in general, I think we can say something about what nominalizations are possible and what nominalizations are natural.
I guess also related to nominalizations, you have, so for example, an event as a vector focus on these aspects of state transition, of course, right? But also with the roles, but mainly state transition. I guess this idea of nominalization has to do as well with the ability to describe properties of the event itself. Like, for example, saying that this discussion is stimulating, or a fight was violent, or a kiss was passionate, and so on, right? And then you would have to connect the vector with some property of the vector.
Yes, you're right. This is the second order. I mean, you can nominalize the events. I mean, that's another form of nominalization. I haven't worked on that at all, and that would give you a second order representation of events. You would go into some kind of abstract space where the event itself becomes an object that is stimulating, or is whatever it is, fascinating. I mean, you have a lot of so you can have attitudes to events, yes, but I haven't worked on that at all. But I know that there is a lot of nominalization going on with respect to events.
Did you make any study about the idea of events, verbs in project management?
Oh no, I didn't. No, that's an interesting question. Okay, you can read any scientific report, and you will find very many basic verbs. I mean, this is something I discovered. Very many basic verbs. So they are used metaphorically. So any scientific report, any economic report is full of basic verbs, like this investment was eating up the profit. I mean, just I gave the example of eating up profit. Just as an exercise, take any scientific article or any economic report or even any sports report, and you will find lots of metaphorical uses of verbs there. So that's actually quite interesting. And I was surprised when I looked at metaphorical uses of verbs. It's been very little studied. There is a lot of work to do concerning the metaphorical uses of verbs.
The person asking that is actually, complements the question, saying, I ask this because tasks are very related to verbs, and those ideas could improve the communications among stakeholders. Yeah. I guess the area of project management.
Yeah. No, and if you know, I mean, people who study rhetorics, they know that choosing the right verbs, I mean, the right mappings is very important. I mean, what kind of thing you're comparing your arguments, your abstract arguments to.
Would you mind elaborating on the difference between agents and intentional agents and the related conceptual spaces?
Yeah, as I said, an intentional agent must have a representation of the goal. An agent in itself, I mean, an animal moving may not have any particular intention. It may be moving by instinct or just by anything without having a goal representation. Some animals have goal representation. I'm not saying that. But and also we sometimes I mean I have reflexes, and reflexes are actions. I mean I do things with my body, but they are not intentional. So having an intentional action means having a representation of a goal. So we can take simple distinctions like between killing and murdering. The kill and to kill and to murder. To kill is a non-intentional verb. You can accidentally kill somebody, but murder is an intentional verb. Then you must have the goal of killing somebody. So there are verbs that make this distinction. Not very many, but there exists this. So that's my notion. The agent must have a goal space as part of the representation of the action.
You have covered patterns of conceptual spaces. Have you considered what are the meta patterns of those patterns? That is, what things do we map and when do we stop?
I have considered it. I have no good theory to give you here. I mean, I'm thinking about this in various dimensions, but that's nothing I can really talk about. I have no coherent thoughts on that. So I'm sorry.
Every time you say that, I think this is very exciting because we have many students here, and this shows people that you did this amazing work, but there's still a lot to be done, right? Of course, so there are many topics out there.
Yeah.
Another question.
I'm still working on. I'm still trying to expand my theory. I'm still writing lots of papers in various directions here now. So yeah.
Excellent. Very, very good. Do you think language represents well how our conceptual knowledge is organized? Is the geography of concepts more about language as such or conceptual thought dynamics?
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
One instance of divergence between the two might be how we sometimes start using nouns as verbs in English. Let's table this for now, or let's zoom tomorrow.
Yeah. That's a very common phenomenon in English, going from a verb to a noun or from a noun to a verb, and not even changing. I mean, in English, you don't even have to add a suffix to the word here. I mean, you take the zoom and make a verb out of it, and so on. That's very common. Yeah, that's a creative aspect. I mean, we immediately understand these transfers from one class to another, and that's quite amazing. But we notice from the place in a sentence whether it's a noun or a verb, and then we take our minds make this transition automatically without thinking about it, because it's kind of principled. I mean, I'm trying to look a little bit at these transformations. I haven't done much work on it, and I didn't write much about it in my work. But this is one area where I would like to go, how you make these transformations. I mean, going from a verb like hunt to a noun like hunter, we know basically how that works. But there are many other semantic transformations like that we use very frequently, and we are quite good at it. And of course, metaphors is another aspect of this transformation of meaning.
How would a concept such as shape or force, which are ready domains, be represented? A kind of blanket area / volume filling the entire domain, or would it have to be point locations?
No, I don't understand. So could you read the question again?
How would a concept such as shape or force, which are ready domains, be represented?
Yeah, this is this kind of meta question, and I must pass that question because I don't know how to. I mean, these are words describing domains, and I've no idea how to describe the domain of domains. I mean, that's really the meta question. I don't know whether they would be points or regions. I passed the question. I'm sorry.
Okay. For certain nouns, adjectives, and verbs, they might be understood quite delicately, different in different languages. I don't have a specific example yet. When you consider the representations, does the language type is also taken into account? For instance, does it imply that an agent can mainly understand sentence in English?
Yeah, okay. There are differences in how certain constructions are made in different languages. The first example that comes to mind is Slobin's distinction, or no, it's Talmud's distinction between verb-framed and satellite-framed languages. So in a verb-framed languages, no, I'm sorry, I forgot which, but in English at least, you would say that the Talmud's example is that the bottle floats into the cave. So you focus on the manner here. But in Spanish or French, that is the other type of languages. You will say that the bottle enters the cave floatingly. So then the result verb is put in focus. So in English, the more focus is put on the manner verbs, while in the French Romance languages, Turkish and so on, more emphasis is put on the result. But of course, in all languages, you have both result and manners, but there are preferences that are different. And there are subtle differences like this between all kinds of languages. Sometimes you use a verb. I mean, I take a verb thing like hunger, or to be hungry. In English, you are hungry. In French, you have hunger, and in Turkish, you hunger. It's a verb. So the same phenomenon is described with using different language, different word classes.
I remember you talking about this regarding prepositions as well, right? And how different metaphors would influence, like, for example, your example of stars in the sky in English, while stars on the sky in Swedish, right?
Yeah. And the fly is on the ceiling in Swedish, but it's in the ceiling in English. So you have both.
Versus metaphor, right?
Yeah, no, prepositions are always tough. Whenever you're learning a new language, it's very difficult to learn the system of prepositions. And then, of course, there are languages that don't even have prepositions, like Finnish and so on. You have to learn 14 cases instead of learning prepositions. So this kind of mapping, the things that are normally expressed by prepositions, they differ a lot between languages. Approaches are very often used metaphorically, and the metaphorical mappings are sometimes totally different.
Very complex, right?
Yeah.
How arbitrary can quality domains be? For example, I can imagine that the adjective dangerous is a convex region on the benign deadly continuum. Do you think many quality domains are built in an ad hoc manner?
Very good question. I don't have a full answer. When I study these adjectives, I try to focus on perceptual domains where we know something about the perceptual mechanism, what we pick up, how we represent color, for instance, or how we represent taste. For some domains, like I mentioned, the kinship domain, we know something about the underlying structure. And for emotion space, we also know a little bit. I mean, some people say there are 2 dimensions of motion, some say 3, but yeah, we can say something about positive, negative, active, passive. These are the main dimensions in emotions. So I can't give a full answer when it comes to dangerous, but of course that's on the positive, negative dimension mainly. Then there may be other aspects to the word of dangerous.
Mm-hmm. Can you explain more about what do you mean by epistemic domain?
I threw it in when it came to some very rare prepositions. But actually, when I wrote my book on the geometry of meaning, I didn't make a study on demonstratives, but I've recently written a paper together with a Croatian linguist on demonstratives, because demonstratives in Croatians are immensely rich. I mean, you can find all kinds of dimensions there. And one dimension, when you turn from Slavic languages don't have articles like a and the, but when you turn it from this and that, which is an ordinary demonstrative pointing out things in space, then you turn them into when you know about this object or not know about it. So if I say there is a piano in the living room, I'm indicating that you don't know about this piano, but I'm introducing it now. And once you know about it, I can say that on the piano there is a vase of flower. So no, the is marking that I indicate that you know this. So the a and the are development out of demonstratives into the epistemic domain. So that's if you want to read about that paper, you will see a little bit about what I mean by the epistemic domain. That's about what I assume about what you know and not know when I use articles.
What is required in the action space for naming? In other words, how can robots name action space? Are gestures the same as naming?
No, I mean, what we did in this experiment was just to have a finite number of actions. I mean, we had 10 actions, hand actions, and we trained the network to classify them. For have a full repertoire of manner actions, you need a much more complicated system. We did it with humans doing things. You need also to have cars running and dogs barking, or not barking, it's not a good example of dogs waving their tails would be a non-human action. We need a much more complicated system. So I would say that the identification of action is just in its infancy. I mean, we know we have the artificial systems are still very primitive for identifying actions, and how we learn that as children, I don't know very much about. We are just beginning to understand how we represent actions in our minds.
Mm-hmm. Are Bayesian inference processes compatible with concept learning described by the conceptual space theory?
In general, I try to avoid Bayesian methods. I mean, they're good for certain purposes, but I would say, I mean, try to implement probability functions and to calculate them. You have to have a lot of information about conditional probabilities, not just first order, but second or third order probability and so on, in order to make any reasonable predictions. So for me, the implementation of Bayesian mechanism is a tough one. They can be used to explain all kinds of decision making and so on, but for robotics, I would not recommend them.
Mm. Does fluid dynamics relate to how that region of space is occupied to determine the density of the force patterns? For example, as you said, water.
I missed the first adjective.
Does fluid dynamics
yeah,
relate to how the region of space is occupied to determine the density of the force patterns? For example, as you said, water does not have a shape, yet it has a certain viscosity, so that its movement reveals that it's water and not some other transparent fluid through the coherence of its moving pattern.
Very interesting point. The short answer is yes. And then don't ask me to elaborate on it, because I have to think much more about it. Actually, there was an Australian PhD who wrote about modeling these kinds of aspects in dynamic patterns. So you could model whether an egg would break or not. I mean, depending on the force patterns within the egg, and that you really use these fluid dynamic principles. But that's nothing I'm an expert in, and the idea is very interesting. And as I said, the short answer is yes.
Mm.
The longer answer is please do some work in the area.
Peter, we still have questions here, but I think we have to wrap up. I will send you all the questions afterwards. I thank you very, very much. I mean, many people are thanking you for this great talk. People are saying that Conceptual Spaces is their favorite book and things like that. I myself a great admirer of your work, and I'm very happy to present this work, especially to the conceptual modeling community.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, I mean, people can send me emails and ask questions as well. That's one way of doing it. Yeah.
Great. So thank you very much
do that. Yeah. Okay.
For the generosity of being here and giving this talk and answering all these questions.
And we really all the people in the audience for watching me and for asking these difficult questions.
Thank you. Next week we continue with EROSS with another talk by Giancarlo Trujillo from the University of Alicante in Spain. Giancarlo is very well known in conceptual modeling, and he will give a talk entitled "Conceptual Modeling Meets Machine Learning in the Data and Key Performance Indicator Analytics." So again, the symbolic together with the more numeric type of reasoning. So I hope to see you all here. Again, always 4 o'clock Central European Summer Time on Wednesdays. And again, Peter, thank you very much for this. I hope you all enjoy BOSC during this week. And until then, stay safe. Bye.